Hello, world history. This is Mr. Janosiak coming at you with another lesson. Today, we're going to be focused on the Middle East. Now, the past couple weeks of remote learning, I have largely read from the book directly because I think it is simpler that way, it is more precise that way. But this particular chapter, which covers the Middle East and North Africa in the early 1900s, is very, very long and it has a lot of names and dates and information. And so I'm going to be starting and stopping a lot to try to hit on like really the important stuff. So if this video isn't, perfect, please be forgiving as I'm trying to make this as simple for you to just hit the important stuff from this region. So a question we're asking ourselves is, how did European colonialism lay the groundwork for the emergence of the modern Middle East? With some themes being religious tensions played a major role in shaping events in the Middle East before and after World War I. The decline and end of the Ottoman Empire aroused the conflicting forces of nationalism and imperialism in both North Africa and the Middle East, with our focus on this region, which is the Middle East. Click here. And really, this starts with the decline and the eventual collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So, the Middle East for hundreds of years had been under the rule of the Turks and the Ottomans, but had been falling apart leading up to World War One. Lots of people within the Ottoman Empire have been calling for constitutional reforms because the Ottomans had controlled lots of different ethnic groups, and those ethnic groups, following the rising tide of nationalism, were calling for more representation and even some calling for independence. In 1909, a national group called the Young Turks overthrew the Sultan, where they did try to modernize, westernize, and industrialize the empire, which were all themes for the globe throughout this time. And as we have seen in the past, it caused changes in parts all around the world, and it will be no different in the Middle East. The Young Turks and the Ottoman Empire joined the Germans in World War I, hoping to show their military force to try to gain some territory from the Allies, but they join the wrong side and they lose. And after World War I, the Allies dissolve the Ottoman Empire. So Turkey, this is blocking. First, the Ottoman Empire is dissolved. The Turks want to make sure that they hold on to what they consider their homeland, which is the Anatolia Peninsula. In December 1918, the Allies enter Istanbul and they take the Sultan into custody. The Young Turks flee to Germany and hide in Germany, largely to be protected from the Armenian genocide, which I suppose I have a lesson on and I can upload, and I think I will do that. Greeks take territory from the Ottomans, and the Allies control the rest. Turk nationalists, led by General Mustafa Kemal, organized a resistance to Allied occupation, and in 1919 called for independent Turkish state in Asia Minor, which is this peninsula here. In the 1920s, those Turkish nationalists form a new parliament, throw out the Sultan, and call on Muslims to resist foreign occupation. And so this part of the world will frequently use, the powerful people will use religious identity because there are a lot of Muslims in this part of the world. And the idea is that you can use this distinction between religion to call on Muslims to resist Westerners who are thought of to be Christians. And you can rally people to your cause by playing on those religious tensions. Can you see this? I'll pause this in a second, but it says in 1922, the Turks push out the Greeks from this part of the peninsula. And then in 1922, Allies sign a peace treaty with the nationalists, and you have the formation of the nation of Turkey, of the old Ottoman Empire. Okay, so like I said, this is going to be start and stop. This slide was a mess. I've now cleaned it up for you for your notes to look at it. But again, 1922, after World War I, the collapse of the Ottomans, Turks formed the nation of Turkey out of what's left of the Ottoman Empire. We're now going to shift to another part, which is Iran. Let's see if we can see this here. Loading. Okay, we have Iran here. So Iran is born out of what throughout world history was called Persia. Since the 1800s, the British have been involved in Iran, and like most of these colonies, right, a cheap market to sell stuff and to get resources from. Many Persians objected to the favorable treatment of European businesses, which is a classic piece of colonialism, that you support and help Europeans, of course, at the expense of the people who live there, which is where a lot of nationalism grows. In 1906, people demand the Shah, who is the king of Iran, to a new constitution and legislature. They are neutral in World War I. They are a battleground for Europeans. In 1921, Britain withdraws from Persia but supports the overthrow of the government. In the place of the overthrown government, they put Reza Shah Pahlavi into power. Now, if you've read Persepolis, which I think many of you were doing in the beginning of the semester, the Pahlavi dynasty is where a lot of the conflict of that book comes from. So the Pahlavi dynasty, the Shah, they will be in control until the revolution in 1979, which we will cover later. So again, Reza Shah tries to modernize and westernize this part of Iran, but he's an autocrat. So you get some modernization, you get some westernization, which there's a conflict here when you get kind of like Western ideas of liberty and freedom, which will contradict those religious values of Sharia law in the Islamic religion, which will be a conflict for 1979. He's an autocrat. So he's a person who rules with unlimited authority, and one of his legacies is silencing the press and then jailing, exiling, and executing anybody opposed to his rule. He allows allies to move supplies through Iran during World War II. And then Iran becomes a big battleground between the upcoming political, ideological battle of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, where the United States will support his son, which will directly lead to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which overthrows the Shah and then creates the modern government of Iran. This is we're going to talk about this French Mandate next. So remember, after World War I, there is this idea that there will be independence movements for all these places, but then the French and the British create these quote-unquote mandates under the League of Nations, which is just a way for them to then create kind of new colonies after World War I. So they call them mandates under the League of Nations, but it's just kind of colonialism by another name. And we are going to do the French Mandate first, which encompasses what we know today as Syria and Lebanon. So right during World War I, the Allies promised independent Arab states in return for help to resist the Ottomans. In 1920, the Syrian Congress meets, so right after World War I, to name Greater Syria independent and put Faisal ibn Hayaz in charge. But this is kind of the failure of these Allied powers, is that you have an opportunity here to create independent states and some sort of peace and stability, but instead Britain and France refuse to accept, and then they divide this region between themselves, just like I've showed you here. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was in the middle of World War I, so as people are fighting and dying on the battlegrounds and they're trying to create a new world, there's a secret agreement between Britain and France, which shows kind of the failure of leadership of these imperial powers, where they both acknowledge that even after the war, they will keep their hold on this region. Again, a failure of long-term vision for this area, as they both secretly agreed to kind of colonize this region after the war. Here is Syria, modern-day Syria, and then here's modern-day Lebanon, just as a map to show you. So Syria and Lebanon, French control under the French Mandate. So they established governments and economic development, but of course, in these areas, there's that undercurrent of nationalism. So calling for this idea of throwing away the Europeans and forming local representation and local nation states. In 1925, the Druze Rebellion against French rule, joined by Arab nationalists. 2 years later, put down by the French, but again, showing the discontent of the local people, resisting European power. After this, French separates Lebanon from their mandate with limited self-rule, and then they demand that power is shared by Christians, Sunni, and Shias with the French veto. So again, even if these groups share power, the French can always agree or disagree with them, so they don't really have that much power. And then this idea here is that you have these three very different religious groups and you try to get them to cooperate with one another, but that's really just going to create religious and ethnic tension, which is one of the long-term causes of instability in this region over the next almost to the present. Nearly identical paths to self-government. In 1940, the French are defeated by the Nazis. You get the Vichy government, which we will talk about, but it is essentially the quote-unquote French government, really controlled by the Nazis. And then you get the Free French government after the war. The Free French government allows elections, hooray! But then, when they don't like the results, they arrest the officials that are elected. Boo! However, at this point after World War II, there is international pressure for France to recognize the independence of Syria and Lebanon, and they achieved that independence in, I have it here, 1946. See, right after World War II.